So welcome and thank you for attending our presentation on reimagining Foglietta Plaza. I'm Mary Purcell, Vice President of Society Hill Civic Association. And in a moment, I'll hand you over to Michael Miller and Cindy Sanders of OLIN Studios, renowned experts in landscape architecture. Society Hill Civic Association engaged OLIN in a programming or use study for Foglietta Plaza, a park at the east end of our neighborhood that houses the Korean War and Beirut memorials. The study is limited in scope to the desired uses of the park, which is a critical first step. And while the scope doesn't include design, you will see an inkling of some design possibilities in the presentation. This park, as I say, is both fortunate and challenged in having many stakeholders. And the study shows that there are indeed common goals across the groups as well as some differences. I want to thank all of those who participated, and in particular, those in the city and the state who have supported this process. Councilmember Mark Squilla, State Rep Mary Isaacson, and her Chief of Staff, Samantha Pearson, as well as Chuck Davies of PennDOT. I also thank my fellow steering committee members, Lorna Katz-Lawson, Bob Kramer, Roseanne Loesch, Molly McIntyre, and Larry Spector, our president. Again, thank you for attending this evening, and I turn you over to Michael Miller of OLIN.
Great, thanks, Mary. So we are really excited to share with you tonight the work that we have done over the last few months. This really represents an incredible coming together of stakeholders and community members from all different walks to really think seriously about the transformation of a public space in your community. And it's the first of many steps towards realizing that transformation, but we really think that this is the critical one that needs to happen. So I'm going to pull up my screen in a moment, but while I'm doing that, Cindy, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I'd just like to welcome everybody this evening and know that Foglietta Plaza is well studied, has been well studied over the years. And we think there is exciting potential and a lot of energy to make a transformation and really to make it a space for all of the neighborhood and the citizens of Philadelphia. Michael, take it away.
Thanks, Cindy. And so one more thing before I get started, although it is January 2022 and we're all very used to Zoom, of course, there are always fresh challenges, and my internet connection has been acting up tonight. So I think we have it figured out, but if I suddenly cut out on you, I promise it's not personal and we will be right back up and running momentarily. But it's not going to happen. So let's get started. All right, so what we would like to do today is just quickly recap the purpose of the project and our process, because I know some of you folks may not have made our earlier meetings. We want to make sure you're grounded in what we're doing here. Second, we want to summarize the stakeholder and public feedback that we've received so far, and that is really the core of the effort that we're doing. Third, we want to present our programming recommendations based on that feedback. So the recap. When we speak of Foglietta Plaza, this is what we're referring to. So on the east side of Society Hill, just east of Society Hill Towers, west of Columbus Boulevard, it includes the full block bounded by Columbus Boulevard, Spruce Street, 38th Parallel Place, and Dock Street. Also, you'll note that the front street alignment runs through it, but it is pedestrianized and part of the plaza. This study does not include the Philadelphia Vietnam Veterans Memorial to the south, although that's a very important neighbor and a very important piece of context for our study. This is what the plaza looks like today. This is standing on the front street looking east towards Columbus Boulevard. A big open plaza flanked by trees, often like this, not a lot of use, not a lot of life. A few other shots that point to some of the challenges and some of the reasons maybe that it's a bit underused. There are a lot of somewhat awkward grade changes. These also create accessibility challenges for many people. And there's also this maze-like quality to it with narrow passages, high walls that obstruct sight lines, make it feel a bit less safe and welcoming than you would want in a public space. It's important to digress for just a moment and understand some of the complexities of ownership and jurisdiction here, because that does drive some of the complexities of rethinking design. So now we're looking in an aerial perspective. We're looking towards the south. So Columbus Boulevard here is the left, 38th parallel place on the right. So part of Foglietta Plaza, as many of you know, is over I-95. As such, the land and the right-of-way is owned by PennDOT, by the state of Pennsylvania. To the west of that, the Front Street alignment and the rest of the park is owned by the city of Philadelphia. So there is a property line between city and state running through the middle of the space. It gets a little more complex than that. The city of Philadelphia actually owns the improvements over the highway. So the things you see at the surface, the pavement, the walls, the trees are owned by the city, although the land and the bridge below are owned by the state. And this also goes for the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And then finally, jurisdiction for maintenance of the space today is split as well. Again, PennDOT maintains the bridge structure, City of Philadelphia maintains the part that they own wholly, and then a nonprofit that many of you may know, ILMAC, the Interstate Land Management Corporation, is specifically tasked with maintaining lands above and adjacent to and below I-95. So they maintain the portion of Foglietta that's above. Okay, so as Cindy said, there have been a lot of studies of this space before, but they haven't always resulted in change. And one of the difficulties is that there are a lot of stakeholders, both civic stakeholders and also agency stakeholders, as you just saw, concerned with the future of the place. So before revisiting design, before doing any renderings, what we really wanted to do here is to see if we could reach consensus between all the relevant stakeholders on the desired program and use of Foglietta Plaza. So again, this is not really about design, it's about use. It's about what this place should be. So I just said it, it's not a design study, not yet, but that can come later, and that would be a logical next step coming out of this effort. It is also at the moment not a funded capital project either, and that's important to understand. So what we're doing here is an important prerequisite to going after funding and making this real. But right now there isn't money behind construction of a new Foglietta Plaza. So when we say stakeholders, this is who we mean. So on the civic side, of course, the Society Hill Civic Association, which is sponsoring this study, also some of the nearby neighbors, Society Hill Towers, Penn's Landing Square, groups representing the memorials that are present in and adjacent to it, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the Korean War Memorial, the business improvement districts that Foglietta Plaza is kind of between jurisdictions of business improvement districts, but it's quite near both South Street, Head House Square, and Old City Business Improvement District. We also thought it was important, speaking of nearby neighbors, to talk to the company Elcor that is developing the residential tower just to the north, because they, in a sense, represent the future neighbors of the park. Then on the agency side, of course, we knew we needed to speak to PennDOT as the owners and operators of the highway, City of Philadelphia, ILMAC, who we've spoken about, that maintains a good part of the plaza, and then also DRWC because of their interest in the waterfront right adjacent to the space. So what we did after we got started is do initial civic and agency stakeholder interviews with all of those groups one-on-one. We followed that up with 2 public meetings that some of you may have participated in. We did a walking tour of the site, and we also did a Zoom meeting like this, where we gathered feedback both through the Q&A in the chat and also through some live polling, and you'll see the results of that today. We also did a quick existing conditions survey of the site to understand what's out there right now. And then we came back after we digested all of that, thought about what it meant. We gave a draft presentation to all the stakeholders and got feedback. So what you're seeing today is the results of that process, of the initial interviews, of the feedback on our draft ideas, and further follow-up interviews and discussions among the steering committee. So this has been through a lot of layers of review, a lot of iterations, and we think it really reflects what's out there to learn about the place. So as you can imagine from all of those conversations, there is an incredible amount of detail, but we would like to focus in on just a few really key takeaways that are important to understand. First of all, the great news, which is that a broad consensus exists that Foglietta Plaza should be greener, more attractive and better used, but quiet and not overly programmed. So that's a really clear and helpful statement of intent for the site of what it should feel like, how it should be. So from the online public meeting that we did, we asked people to say, how would you describe Foglietta Plaza's ideal character? And we heard clean, attractive, and safe. We also heard, what would you like to change? And the top two things we heard were more green, less paving. Super clear. We heard similar themes from some of the other stakeholders. So from our first veterans meeting, we heard that it should be a family-oriented place with benches, grass, nature, passive recreation, a well-used place that will have fewer issues, including vagrancy. We heard from the business improvement district to soften it up, make it more green, more trees. But we also heard a cautionary note. We heard from people that they want it to be better used, but not too busy, not too noisy. We heard that it should be attractive, but not an attraction. And we also often heard a contrast with Spruce Street Harbor Park on the waterfront, which has a lot of events, a lot of food and beverage. So we heard that this should be a different kind of space, quieter. So again, a lot of agreement there. But there's also some disagreement. And we'll go into some more detail on this later, but we want to highlight what we think is one of the more significant issues to work through here. So we know that Foglietta Plaza is already home to many memorials, and everybody was pretty unanimous in wanting the existing memorials to remain. Again, when we asked in the Society Hill public meeting, the top three elements that should remain, we heard seating, trees, and memorials. We heard in some of the comments the memorials should stay, but they should be better integrated into the design. And I think this is something that the memorial groups would agree with as well. On the other hand, when we talked about the possibility of new memorials, we got a very different read. So memorials were at the bottom of the desired uses, getting 0 votes in the public meeting, below farmers markets, food trucks, and skateboarding. This is important because we know that there are proposals out there to locate at least one additional memorial in Foglietta Plaza. So we've spoken with the leader of a group, Dave Henderson, who is interested in establishing a memorial to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And we spoke with him about Foglietta Plaza and why there. And he said, right now we don't have a memorial for veterans of those wars in Pennsylvania. And this is where people go on Veterans Day, Memorial Day. They go maybe not to Foglietta Plaza proper, but to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial next door where ceremonies are held. So it's become this collective place of mourning for the families of those killed in action. And there's also this intergenerational component between those families and some of the Vietnam veterans. So, this is a tough one. And we wanted to really drill down with folks in the community about why existing memorials were fine, but maybe people didn't want new memorials. And so we heard a few things there. We heard that the veterans deserve recognition, but if the goal is to draw more people to the space, that the more memorials won't necessarily do it. They tend to draw people on those holidays, on those event days, but in between may not be as active. And so it's counter to that goal of the neighborhood. Similarly, we heard that there's a desire for more neighborhood park space for Society Hill, and a concern that if the space were filled up just with memorials, there wouldn't be room left over for that. So I think what we heard was not in opposition to the idea of memorials per se, but a questioning of what the trade-offs were and what the right balance should be between memorials and other uses within the space. Okay, so those were some of the big themes when we spoke to the civic stakeholders. On the agency side of things, we heard considerations related to funding, related to infrastructure investment and timelines. So one really important thing to know is that PennDOT is planning to rebuild this portion of the highway in 20 to 25 years. And so that means that anything that is on that cap portion will need to be removed and either replaced or placed into storage, brought back. So that means a few things. It means that if memorials are located there, they would need to be placed into storage or a temporary home found. It also means that we maybe want to think of design changes here as somewhat more temporary and possibly kind of a living lab for more permanent redesign. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that might mean. Then finally, because this is currently unfunded, we spoke with all the agencies about funding, and we heard that there's probably a relationship between what we're studying here, programming on the one hand, and funding on the other. So from the state level, there may be funding for multimodal transportation improvements, so pedestrian bike improvements, and also for accessibility. And accessibility may be broadly framed, making sure it's open to everybody. We also heard that foundation funding is a likely option, and that this may be less rigid in terms of permanency, which is important when you think about the highway timeline. And it could bring in some program-specific sources. We heard that something like memorials or public art, which is something we'll talk about as well in this meeting, could attract specific funding sources, but that some funders may explicitly not fund those things. So there's probably going forward going to be a really important tailoring between the funding source and the program and the plaza, making sure that it's still consistent with a community vision. Finally, we heard from ILMAC, which again is responsible for maintenance, that we really need to think not just about capital funding, but operations and maintenance funding, and really match that with the program in the space and what it's going to require to maintain. All right, so what does all that mean? What does that make us think about the future of this place? So the first thing we did is try and just create a brief statement that summarizes what this place should be like. And again, if you think of that first takeaway about the consensus, we were trying to capture that here. So we said an attractive, calm, green place integrating neighborhood park elements and memorials while connecting Society Hill to the Delaware riverfront. And that last piece is important too, because it has this larger role in the city as well as being a neighborhood space. And because this is an existing public space, our first question is always, what stays? What should we keep? What's there? Trees are a good place to start. So we heard that the place should be greener, and it's actually got a lot of pretty healthy, mature trees. And again, if we think of that 20 to 25 year timeline, it takes a while to grow a tree. So we want to make sure we make the most of the green that is there today. We also heard unequivocally that the existing memorials need to remain. So again, within Foglietta Plaza, that's the Korean War Memorial and the Beirut Memorial, which you see at the right there. The next question is what needs repair? And we know that that's quite a bit. So in particular, the hardscape, the pavement, the walls are showing some significant deterioration. So in some cases, we might think about removing these to add more green, but if they're going to remain, they need repair to be safe and to avoid further deterioration. And some of these cases of repair really speak to issues of health, safety, and accessibility. In some cases, because things have just fallen apart over the decades. In other cases, because this plaza was built in a time with different standards before the Americans with Disabilities Act. So if we intervene here, we'll need to bring it up and should bring it up to current standards of accessibility. So then the next question is what's new? And this is the fun part. This is where we get to imagine a little bit and dream a little bit about what this place could be. So thinking about green, thinking about flexible neighborhood use, one really basic idea is a big central lawn to focus the space around. You know, it's green, it's open, it's something that can be used casually by people in small groups and can also accommodate larger groups of people during events or holidays. And then on the subject of green again, gardens. This is the Lurie Garden in Chicago. And it's in a similar kind of location out on the edge of the city between the city and the lake. And It's peaceful, but it's also a destination unto itself that draws people there. And actually, Mary had a really good idea early on when we were talking about funding related to accessibility broadly defined. And she said, what if this is a sensory garden that really appeals to all the senses? So for visitors that could be deaf or could be blind or could have other disabilities, that this would really draw them. But it would speak to everybody. It would speak to neighborhood residents. It would speak to visitors to the memorials. It could be a space of healing for people experiencing trauma of all kinds. So we don't know exactly what gardens mean yet. That could be part of the design process, but that's one idea, one flavor that we think could be really powerful. Then we think about how to make this place more comfortable and inviting. And seating is a really simple and basic way to do that. Both through fixed elements that really communicate civility and warmth, like this wooden bench here. Movable seating that can be a bit more casual and flexible. People can move it around, make it their own. And then integrated seating. So one thing you don't want to do is just fill a space up with too many chairs, too many benches. But if you build in walls and steps that are at the right height of the right dimension, so they're comfortable and inviting, they can accommodate more people on busier days while fading into the background of the park on others. Lighting is really important. So some of the lighting right now is in poor repair, so it's a basic safety issue. But taking that to another level, lighting can be really the thing that transforms nighttime use of the space and makes it feel warm and welcoming and a place that you want to be. And certainly this time of year, when we speak of lighting, it's not just the middle of the night. It's first thing in the morning. It's after work on the way home, kids coming home from daycare, making this a space that has a life in those times as well. Signage and wayfinding, we heard a lot about the legibility of the space and how it maybe wasn't working, both as a connector to the riverfront, but also for folks who are trying to go and see and experience the memorials, not understanding the connections between them, not being able to find them, not understanding them as a coherent collection. So there's a lot we can do there. And then finally, thinking about this being over I-95. On the one hand, there's an ambition that this place is peaceful and quiet, but then on the other hand, there's the reality of that noise. And so building in something that can attenuate that noise, we think could have a dramatic impact on the space, but that also should be beautifully, elegantly detailed, like the wall that you see in this photograph here, and that maybe it can have another function as well, as in addition to a sound wall. Accessibility improvements we spoke about before, but like everything else, there's a practical side, but we want to make it more. So this is a sloped walkway in one of our projects that negotiates a grade change. It provides accessibility, but it's also a meander through a garden. And it's an experience that people just want to walk to have. So it's elevating that idea of accessibility. Okay, so those are things that we think are clear wins based on what we heard. But again, there are some points where we don't yet have consensus. We talked about memorials a little bit. We want to mention some of the others here and some of our thoughts on it. So we know that in the last community meeting, there was a pretty extended discussion about dogs and dog parks and a lot of differing opinions there. And I will say for all of these contested items, we don't think the conversation is closed. These conversations need to continue going forward, and certainly throughout any design process that follows what we're doing here. But based on what we've heard so far and our understanding of the space, I think we would say our preliminary thought is this is not an appropriate place for a dedicated off-leash dog park like what you see here on the Schuylkill River Trail. Probably doesn't fit the quiet contemplative character, probably isn't the best neighbor to memorials. But we also know that it's a neighborhood park, and so on-leash dogs are likely to be a part of the life of that park and should be accommodated. Cafes and food trucks. This is another one where we heard different opinions. So on the one hand, it could bring an amenity, a convenience, it could draw people there. On the other hand, concerns about noise, concerns about odors, concerns about the viability. Putting in a fixed cafe up front is a big investment and a big financial risk, in addition to being something that not everybody agrees on. So I think we would not recommend that. Again, we think this conversation should continue even beyond construction. And so if at some point there is a desire to have food and beverage service within the park, something like food trucks could be brought in later to serve that need without having it being baked into the plan. Community gardens. So we talked about one kind of garden before. We also know that there are some in the community that are really interested in community garden plots for food, flower production, that sort of thing. On the other hand, we also know that some people were concerned about appearance, maybe them being untidy. And we also heard that they can sometimes be kind of semi-private. So, here too, ongoing conversation. That is really the number one thing. One thing about community garden plots is that they are relatively lightweight investments. So if consensus can be reached and they're part of the project upfront in the design process, they could be included, but they too are something that could be added later on if there is a flexible area that could accommodate them. Additional memorials. So we spoke about this a little bit before, but circling back to that, one thing that we think is really important to note here is that there is a whole separate approval process for memorials and also for public art in the city of Philadelphia. So they need to be approved if they are on city land or receiving city funding by the Art Commission, and that starts by reaching out to the Office of, I think it's Arts, Culture, and the Creative Economy, which is responsible for this. And that process includes additional community engagement. So we know that there are folks out there proposing an additional memorial for the space. We know that they have not met with the Society Hill Civic Association yet, but we also know that in addition to this engagement process here, there is a whole nother approval and engagement process that they must go through if they want to locate at Foglietta Plaza. The same goes for public art. So we haven't really talked about this yet, but this was something that in the public meeting here, last time people ranked very high in the list of things that they would like to see at Foglietta Plaza. On the other hand, the art that you see here, which was the subject of one of the earlier studies for Foglietta Plaza, proved contentious. It was one of the reasons that that design process did not go through. So we know that just like memorials, public art is a potent cultural product. It's meant to elicit strong reactions, strong emotions. And so it's likely to be contentious in just the same way. So again, we recommend ongoing discussion engagement. And just like the memorials, this will need to go through the process with the Art Commission in Philadelphia, if any is to be located here at Foglietta Plaza. And then finally, events and activities. So this is where that discussion about how active should the space be, the comparison with Spruce Street Harper Park comes up. So we suggested maybe some lower key activities like art and craft markets, daytime music or dance performances, exercise classes. And again, got mixed reactions. Some people really liked that idea. Some felt it was already present elsewhere in the neighborhood. Some felt like it was too much. The good thing about this kind of programming is that it's very ephemeral. It's very changeable. It requires a flexible surface to be built into the design. But this is something that whoever is managing the park after construction can adapt to, can experiment, can get public feedback, can change course. So this is a place where there can be a lot of fine tuning with all of the stakeholders over time. Okay, so that's a lot already, but there's some other things that we should be thinking about too. One is that timeline of I-95. So we're here and we're looking at 20 to 25 years, we think, until it'll be rebuilt. There's always uncertainty, but that is what PennDOT is planning right now. So what does that mean? It's too long to leave it like it is today. It's literally falling apart in places. It needs to be invested in just to bring it up to basic standards of health and safety. On the other hand, that is probably too short for the highest level of investment. It's shorter than the life cycle that we typically design for in a public space. So we're really looking at relatively inexpensive interim improvements, but it's not the short-term temporary that you see in a pop-up that's only up for a season or two. It's a long-term temporary. And so it's kind of a tricky in between, but also potentially a very interesting one. There's also a difference in what we do on the cap, on that bridge over the highway, and on grade potentially, because we know that the cap has to be rebuilt. The on grade portion, not necessarily. So on the one hand, that means that something like a new significant public artwork, like a new memorial, might be better off located here on grade. On the other hand, we wouldn't necessarily advocate doing only temporary improvements on the cap and only permanent improvements on the on-grade portion, because the space is one space. It's designed as a space, it reads as one space, it should be like that. And so if the cap is going to receive a permanent investment when it's rebuilt, we imagine that the western half would too. So we think that this creates some nuance, but in general, we think that improvements should be done in a cohesive way to the same level of finish when they occur. So again, back to funding, which we know will tie to programming. So we heard that the state may have several very specific types of funding that could be brought to bear here. Again, for multimodal transportation and also for accessibility, which we know the plaza needs. Foundations, again, there are several in Philadelphia that are very active in public spaces. And so they may fund specific programmatic elements, they may fund aspects of the park itself, or they may be interested in an experimental approach that takes advantage of the fact that this is somewhat temporary. And again, memorials are art. They may attract some funding, may preclude others. So we think conversations with potential funders early on in the design process is very important to this being viable. So how do we start thinking about putting it all together? Again, we're pre-designed here, but how do we start imagining what the space might feel like and how all of these things might coexist? One way to do that is to think about precedents, examples of spaces out there that we can learn from, which is something we do all the time as designers. So one that came up again and again in our stakeholder conversations was Washington Square. It's nearby, it's in the neighborhood, it's much loved, and it does a lot of things that Foglietta Plaza should do based on what we heard. It's very green, it's very well used, but it doesn't rely on a lot of events and heavy programming to achieve that. It's a neighborhood park, it's relatively quiet. At the same time, you see in the background of this image here, it incorporates memorials. So it has that function, but it blends in with the rest of the park. But if you want to go there, you want to see that, experience it. It has a dedicated space that lets that memorial breathe. It's connective. It unites the cityscape around it. It's got places to sit. You also see there are some smaller memorials as well as the larger one that are a part of it. And again, it's very green. We should acknowledge that there are some very real differences and some reasons that Foglietta Plaza can't be Washington Square. Its relationship to the city around it is different. Washington Square is one of the original 5 squares of Philadelphia. It's built into the city fabric and it's got buildings surrounding it, which means both that these create a sort of outdoor room and they create a lot of eyes on the park, a lot of doors, a lot of footfalls that give it some of that life. Foglietta Plaza is out over the highway, so it's never going to be quite that. But at the same time, we know that there is a new building going into the north. We know that there are new buildings planned on the riverfront. So it's going to get a little bit more of that neighborhood life than it has today. Another project that came to mind when we were thinking about this is one of our own that we've already shown a couple images of. This is the Bud and Susie Rogers Garden at the Art Museum in Akron, Ohio. And we thought of it for a few reasons. It includes some of the elements that we talked about here. It includes a big open central lawn. It includes these lush gardens. It includes this wall, which is not a sound wall, but could be. But we also thought about it because it's a sort of flexible container. So when we designed it, the museum knew that they wanted to locate new artworks there, but they didn't have them in their collection yet. So we had to design a series of environments that could take on new things, give them a home that wouldn't feel dead and empty before they arrived. And so if we think about some of the question marks in Foglietta Plaza, if we think about, will there be public art? Will there be new memorials? How do we include things like that and have it have an everyday neighborhood life? We think this is a good example of how that can be achieved. So this is a view down lower of that lawn and the wall, looking up through the gardens, which also has that zigzag accessibility route we talked about. It can accommodate larger events, but again, it doesn't feel oversized when it's quieter and emptier. Again, the gardens, the walkway through them, which is accessible to everybody. And looking overhead, you can see that it's starting to fill in with art pieces up here. But again, it's used, people go there, and it doesn't rely on that to activate it. Another project of ours that came to mind is the Ohio State University Spirit of Women Park. And we thought of this because it's not a war memorial, but it's a memorial of a kind. It's a monument, but it's very integrated into its surroundings. And one of the concerns we heard about memorials at Foglietta Plaza is that they're not really knit into the fabric of the park. So it has these images and text below the surface of a fountain, which people can get up close to, they can read, they can appreciate, but there's also this kind of visceral delight that a child can enjoy without having to absorb the heaviness of the monument. And then it's tied into gardens that surround it. So again, thinking about the gardens at Foglietta Plaza, this is the kind of feel that we might imagine to that and its relationship to other elements. Last one we want to talk about is the porch at 30th Street Station, which many of you may have seen. Now, this is a much busier, more colorful kind of pop-up-y space than what we imagine for Foglietta Plaza, but there is a lot to learn here. The first is just simply how transformative some temporary installations can be on an otherwise dead concrete apron, if you look back to what that can do and the life that it can bring. The other interesting thing about this is that they've really studied it in this very precise and quantitative way to learn how people are using it when they add and subtract elements, how that changes it. And they've taken an iterative approach. They've done a couple of temporary installations, and then they're looking at how this will influence a permanent redesign of the plaza that goes along with investments in the train station. So we think this is a really good case study of how we could actually use this long temporary time frame of 20 to 25 years to the advantage of Foglietta Plaza. So then finally, again, not designing, we wanted to just think really broadly about what some of the spatial relationships might be within the plaza, how some of these elements we've talked about might fit together. So if we think about a great central lawn, maybe that could occupy the fairly empty plaza that runs through on the central axis here, opposite the Korean War Memorial. That could be flanked by gardens. And we know there's planting there today, but it's not very lush or engaging in different seasons. The walkways are cramped, the walls are high. So maybe we can either lower the walls in the gardens or we can raise the walkways and make that a much richer, more compelling experience. Connectivity is also super important to the plan. So we know that Spruce Street in particular is a really important connection to the river for pedestrians and also for bikes. And that's particularly so now that the permanent bike trail has gone in north-south. So we think perhaps there could be a separated raised bike lane there that provides a better connection than the existing Belgian block, but doesn't encourage people to ride on the sidewalk, which we also heard was an issue. Front Street is a really important connection. We think that should remain a pedestrian connection. And then finally, because potentially there's less pavement in the heart of the park, we think more can be made of some of these paved connections. So this little yellow diagonal hatch that we show here, so those paved surfaces can accommodate that kind of temporary program and events if those are desired. There's plenty of space for that, even while making the park greener. The other thing we asked ourselves is, okay, we don't know if there are going to be additional memorials. We don't know if there's going to be additional art. But if there were, if everybody agrees that that's what should happen, how might they fit in? How might they be integrated in a way that makes sense, but doesn't take over the park and that leaves room for more neighborhood park functions? So we looked at a couple potential locations. One is the southwest corner of the plaza. For those of you that know it well, right now, that's kind of an unfinished lawn that's not really used a whole lot, but it's in a prime location. It's right at the corner that gets the most traffic. It's very high visibility. And if it were a memorial, there would be a strong connection to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and potentially also the Korean War Memorial by removing part of the existing bathroom building that is not used there. The other advantage of this location is that it is not on the I-95 cap, meaning if a major element were installed there, it could probably remain in place while the highway is rebuilt. But we did also look at locations over the cap because that's where a lot of space is. So we could also imagine a new memorial or new art located embedded within gardens on the south side of the lawn. Finally, oh, pardon the typo there. We could also imagine something on the north side. There's a little less space within the gardens there, but if we think about the integration of a sound wall in this location, that could go more vertical. And it could be a way to take that functional element and really have it do more for the plaza and for the park. So again, these are just some very preliminary ideas, thinking about spatial relationships and trying to visualize program. They are not designs. But we want to start to gesture at how you might start thinking about designing this space. So what's next? We think the first thing is ongoing dialogue. We know that we made great progress here, but we're not finished yet. There are some conversations that are still open, and we would encourage everybody here and all the other organizations to continue those. The next is thinking about who will lead design and construction of this. So the Society Hill Civic Association has really exhibited great leadership in hosting these conversations and sponsoring this programming study. But at some point, to be realized, another organization will need to take this on. And then finally, we've talked about it before, there needs to be funding to support both additional design work and also construction. So thinking a little bit more specifically about what that might look like. We just finished a programming study. Design from here would follow a series of pretty standard phases for a design process, starting with concept design, going into schematic design, and ultimately to construction documents that would show how the space could be built. And so much depends on timing, on complexity and other things. But altogether, you might imagine a 1.5 to 2 year process for that. Society Hill Civic Association could continue to sponsor this process through very early phases of design that are still really rooted in community engagement. But again, at a certain level of complexity, this will need to be led by an agency or a suitable nonprofit. And so who might that be? When you think of those agency stakeholders that we spoke to as part of this process, it would be somebody like the City of Philadelphia or somebody like the Delaware River Waterfront Corporation that would be able to really lead this thing through construction and to realization, to producing a new plaza. And then there needs to be an organization to manage it going forward from there. So a lot to figure out, but again, we've already come a long way. And I think we just want to leave you with the thought of what is possible, both what is possible with design and reconstruction of the plaza, some of the images we showed on the left, but also the kind of change that you could make today. So even though there's a lot of work to imagine design, to get funding, to get a lead agency on board, to build it, that isn't to stop anybody in the community from starting to improve this today, whether that's through a cleanup day, whether that is through temporary planting, whether that is through events. There is a lot that Society Hill Civic, veterans groups, other stakeholders could do to really start enabling this transformation, and in the process, continuing to build community around this place, which we think is, again, one of the benefits of this process that has started, starting those conversations, building a coalition for the transformation of the space. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Q&A. Okay. So, I'll just go through some of the questions that have come in so far. So what will you do with your info? And do you have a plan to present it to a series of financial benefactors? Mary, would you like to take that one?
Next steps is, first of all, we'll need to really digest the report. This is a very thorough presentation. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Olin. Thank you, Cindy, for all of your good work and your patience and your creativity and your commitment. We're expecting the report shortly. We'll need to digest it, share it with the board, share it with the community, share it with the other stakeholders. And as Michael mentioned, we'll need to further the dialogue. I think my thought is, in particular, talk with folks in the city and in the state to get their ideas, to go to council member Squilla, to go to State Rep Mary Isaacson, once they've had a chance also to digest the report and get their thoughts about the next steps. As Michael mentioned, this is not a funded capital project, and there are some possibilities. As Michael mentioned, the state might fund a multimodal project, accessibility. Those are a couple of types of things that the state is funding. Possibly we could seek some foundation funding. I think we need to further the dialogue a little bit more. So that would be how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you, Mary. Got a question, should the City Redevelopment Authority be involved in some fashion? I don't know about the Redevelopment Authority, but certainly the City of Philadelphia, especially through Parks and Rec. As we said, it's the owner of the space and could potentially take on redesign of the space. So we have involved them in multiple conversations throughout this process. And again, also the Art Commission will come into play if there are proposals for public art or memorials. Let's see, might you incorporate bathrooms? We didn't talk about this in the presentation, but this discussion did come up because there are existing bathrooms within the building at the southwest corner of the plaza. We understand that they are not open most of the time. They're sometimes open on event days when there's Memorial Day or Veterans Day there. Bathrooms can be a great amenity in public space, but they're also a big operations and maintenance burden. And I think we did hear pretty significant opposition from a lot of different groups to bathrooms being placed in the space. We did hear from some groups that bathrooms might be more successful if they were paired with a cafe. So if there was an organization on site tasked with managing those bathrooms. But again, we heard a lot of differing opinions on the cafe there. There also are public bathrooms at the waterfronts, just south of Spruce Street Harbor Park. And I believe that there are some that are planned as part of the much larger Penn's Landing Cap Park project just to the north. And that's something I think we talked about in our first public meeting, but less so in this presentation, is that, that's an important piece of context, that there's going to be a big, fairly heavily programmed park there that's being built by PennDOT and by DRWC. And it'll include a lot of things that may in a way take some of the pressure off Foglietta Plaza to provide them. Let's see. Did you say that a pedestrian bridge across Columbus Boulevard might be considered? We have not considered that as part of it so far. We do think that that connection is super important, and making it very easy for pedestrians and cyclists to cross there. Because it is an at-grade crossing, a pedestrian bridge would require a fair amount of infrastructure and a lot of ramps to get up and get down. So it could be very disruptive to the park. And then from the same person, we got, what did you say might happen with the street at the west end of the project? So that would be 38th Parallel Place, just below Society Hill Towers. And we didn't hear a lot of interest in significant changes to that street. It's a relatively quiet street. So far, we haven't recommended any major changes to 38th Parallel Place.
I can just jump in, Michael. I think you had a couple of things. One was possibly temporary program along that side of the edge. You showed that in one of your possible designs, and I think also the possibility of a bike, sort of bypass around there. Maybe that's what the question's around.
Oh, right. Thank you, Mary. Yeah, we talked a lot about cyclists in the plaza. To the south side, Spruce Street, we know that's an important bike connection with the bike lanes to the west on Spruce Street and the riverfront bike path and trail. Then there's Front Street, which to the south has a bike lane. Right now, it's very difficult to ride a bike through the plaza because there are a bunch of steps. We're recommending that for reasons of pedestrian accessibility, including people in wheelchairs, people with strollers, that become a sloped pathway without steps. We're not recommending that it should be a bikeway, but if it is a sloped pathway, it's more likely that somebody might be tempted to cut through there. And so there are ways to address that. One would be just to detail it and sign it as a pedestrian pathway rather than as a bikeway. But another would be to provide an attractive alternative, which could be a bike lane bypass that goes around the western end of the plaza and connects back north onto Front Street. Let's see.
I could take the man. Someone asked about the Man Full
Sure.
of Trouble. I can just share that is in private ownership and is not within the scope of this project.
Thanks, Mary. Let's see, there's another street question, and then actually two more street questions, and then we'll get back to a couple more for you, Mary. So will Spruce Street return to one-way eastbound at its intersection with Columbus Boulevard? So we considered the pedestrian elements of Spruce Street as part of this study, but really didn't dig into the roadway and modifications to that. So I think that would be a good probably topic for other conversations within the civic, and reaching back out, probably both to the Office of Transportation, Infrastructure and Sustainability with the city. And I know DRWC has been involved with that conversation as well.
And just so that I can add a little bit to that, there is the section of Spruce Street. Many of us who've lived here for a long time know the section of Spruce Street between Front and Columbus for the longest time was one-way eastbound. And for the last few years, it's been two ways. And our president, Larry Spector, and some other folks in the Civic Association have been working for a while with Council Member Squilla and with Otis to look at reversing that back to one-way eastbound. And there is a pilot study, I understand, that will be afoot shortly to take a look at that. But as Michael said, it's not integrated. It's not really a part of what we're looking at in this study, but I can just share that information.
Great. There was also a question, would it be practical to consider closing off 38th parallel place, or is it necessary for traffic flow? You know, certainly we're not traffic engineers, but I think that although it's relatively low traffic, one of the functions of it is for northbound traffic on Front Street to be able to get around the plaza, since Front Street is closed there. And so while it would be possible to go out to Columbus and go back around, that's a lot of turning movements through traffic lights. So that could be something tricky. But certainly if that were pedestrianized, it's already pretty slow speed and quiet, that could improve connections to Society Hill. Then let's see. And then I just want to clarify one other thing from a comment, and then we'll get back to some earlier questions about being concerned about a bike path in the park. So to be clear, we did not propose a bike path in the park. We're proposing that Front Street and all areas inside of the plaza would continue to be pedestrian only. But we do think that Spruce Street to the south might benefit from a bike lane that has a smoother surface than the street right now. And that would actually discourage people from riding on the sidewalk inside the park and disrupting its operations. Let's see, there was a question about timing. So given the disruption of One Dock Place construction for the next 2 to 3 years, when you expect this project to begin, and if it takes 5 years to become real, would this be a financially viable plan considering a redo in the next 15 years? Certainly, as we get closer to rebuilding I-95, the level of investment should become less. But again, something needs to happen. And even at 15 years, temporary improvements could do a lot. But it doesn't need to take 5 years for something to happen. So that timeline that we just put up on the screen, it's a lot to digest, but 2 years or less could be a reasonable time frame for this. A lot of what is going to drive that is not adjacent construction, but really funding and getting a champion at the agency or nonprofit level on board with this. Cindy, it looks like you were going to add something to that.
I think this is one of the riddles of this project, and that is to balance the investment with the future life of the park before the cap is redone. I personally believe that there are a couple of small changes that could be made that would be dramatic, sort of lower investment improvements. One of which is putting a lawn in lieu of much of the paving. As Michael had suggested, that putting richer plantings in some of those planters could be a dramatic improvement. So this is kind of the balance. And the things that will slow this down, really, I think, are ideas of funding and ideas of sort of consensus and political will. But we all know something needs to happen, and everybody's lives will be so much better with these smaller improvements.
Thanks, Cindy. So let's see, there was a question about having met with veteran groups. Does OLIN have a sense that those groups would be amenable to moving the Beirut Memorial to the west side, providing the other memorials be erected only on the West City side? So we did not dig specifically into the location of the Beirut Memorial. Certainly, since it's a smaller piece, it would be easier to relocate. And during highway reconstruction, it's going to have to be at least temporarily relocated. So there is the possibility there, but that's certainly something that's worth circling back with the veterans groups about. Similarly, that idea of concentrating the memorials in one location. And it's something to study from a design perspective, because there could be, if the goal is balance, there could be some advantages to clustering memorials, creating strong relationships, having another part of the park having a strong identity. But there also could be a logic to weaving the two elements, neighborhood park and memorials, together in different spaces. So I could imagine, if we were starting to work on concept design here, those could be two alternatives that we might potentially look at going forward. There was a question, would the water department's Green City Clean Water program be involved in design for stormwater drainage with lots of wildflowers for butterflies being planted, I hope? Yes, that all sounds very nice. And I think the tie-in to PWD and potential funding is a really good idea. It's definitely something to explore. In some cases, to achieve that, what they're interested in is a public space taking on a larger volume of water from adjacent streets or adjacent roads. So it's definitely a significant piece of infrastructure that has a lot of engineering constraints around it, and probably wouldn't work on the cap portion, but it's definitely something that could be a component of the park, especially on the at-grade part, I would think. So that would be a great conversation to have with that agency. And then Mary, there is a question here. Well, first a comment, this is really good work. And then a question that I think is getting at the Society Hill Civic Association's response to the recommendations in this report, which I know that, we're just presenting to the public here, and is all relatively new and fresh, but any thoughts from you on where you might go next with this?
Yes, as I mentioned before, certainly I hope some of our board members are here in the presentation tonight and listening and participating, and in some of the Q&A. We will be receiving OLIN's report and sharing it certainly with the board and with the other stakeholders. And I hope we'll be able to post it on our website and share it with the community. And digest it, as I said, and continue the dialogue and determine what are the next steps that we can take.
Great, thanks, Mary. Let's see, I've got one more question here. Is there space for the GW Memorial at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial space so we can better utilize the space proposed? I think the GW that's referring to the GWAT, or Global War on Terror Memorial, which is what's been proposed. It's a good question. It's just outside our study area. But I think to answer that question, or to answer how it might fit into Foglietta Plaza, the first step would be to understand the scale and the nature of the proposed memorial. So far, we haven't seen a publicly presented design for that. And so memorials can be large, they can be small, they can take a lot of forms. So it definitely seems like there's potential there, but I think getting a handle on the specifics of the proposal would be the next step in really thinking through how it would integrate into any space.
And to add to that, Michael, as I understand it from the public art leadership, that one of the early steps would be actually for the community to be engaged in what the design even should be, along, as opposed to just being, handed a design, that there's an opportunity for community input to the design.
All right, got just a couple more trickling in, so I think we'll take those and then maybe we'll wrap up. So, can something be done to improve the walkability of accessing the park? The cobblestone's a real obstacle to those with difficulty walking. So I would say yes, and that is very much a part of these accessibility improvements that we're talking about. So if we think about the crosswalks that lead to the park, really making sure that those, as well as the space within the park, is accessible to everybody. And that's exactly the kind of thing that we understand the state multimodal and accessibility funding might be able to address. Mary, were you going to add something to that? No. Okay.
Oh, I mean, other than, the historic streets, we have there are not that many of them left anymore, and they're sort of coveted. So while they're not fun to traverse, they're like a thing into itself because they are historic. So I don't. So
Yeah,
what you said, yes.
Yes. All right, so I think that's it for all the open questions in the Q&A. So Mary, I'll turn it back over to you for any closing comments.
Great. Well, I've given most of them already before in terms of outlining what the next steps are. So certainly we'll digest this and share the report when we receive this and share it with the stakeholders. And certainly, if this proceeds to design, which we hope it will, there will be plenty more opportunity for community input. So I would just like to thank Michael for leading this project. It's been a pleasure working with you. I want to thank Cindy as well for her leadership. Thank you everyone for participating in this presentation this evening.
And thank you all. This has been really great to get to work on this, to talk to everybody, to hear more, and to start to imagine a positive future for the space.
Thanks so much.
All
Good
right.
night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.